Welcome to the Inside Elections podcast, where we analyze elections in a nonpartisan, data-driven, and accessible way. In this episode, we're diving into Ohio. With former Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown challenging Republican Jon Husted, what does it mean for the race and the overall fight for the Senate? We'll talk about that and the mystery and magic of race ratings with Kyle Kondik of Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball. Buckle up. I'm Nathan Gonzales, editor and publisher of Inside Elections, the go-to place for nonpartisan analysis for more than 40 years, and I just got back from a family trip in Hawaii's 1st and 2nd congressional districts.
And I'm Jacob Rubashkin, deputy editor of Inside Elections, and while I didn't go anywhere nearly as exotic as Hawaii's 1st or 2nd congressional districts, I did almost get to a congressional district. I fell just short of Maryland's 4th congressional district on my way to Costco over the weekend, which is just on the D.C. side of the border between Prince George's County and Washington, D.C. So I did not get to experience the representation of Democrat Glenn Ivey, but maybe I will make it further out on New York Avenue next time.
But yeah, being in Hawaii was a lot of fun. I tell our family we made a lot of memories, most of them positive. So I guess that's a net win. Before we get into it, let's go through some headlines. Jacob, what should people not miss?
So in Maine, oyster farmer and Army/Marine veteran Graham Plattner is running for the Democratic Senate nomination. He launched his campaign with a splashy video produced by the same team that made the ads for New York mayoral candidate Zoran Mamdani. Plattner is running on a populist platform and says he will not get out of the race, even if Senate Democrats succeed in drawing outgoing Governor Janet Mills into the race against Republican Susan Collins.
One of my favorite parts, two favorite things about this rollout. One is that the candidate fashioning himself as a political outsider launched his campaign with a profile in the New York Times. But also your tweet about comparing his video to Democratic Congressman Jared Golden's past campaign ads. And I think what it was, the term gratuitous shellfish cracking. Is that
gratuitous shellfish cracking? Yes. Which to Plattner's credit, he is an oysterman. But the close up of him shucking the oyster reminded me immediately of a Jared Golden ad from last cycle, which features several close ups of him cracking lobster, because lobster is, a big industry up there and a big piece of Golden's policies. So I thought that there was some remarkable similarities in their presentation, even though it does seem that on their politics, they might be a little further apart on some issues.
Yeah. Well, Republicans in Texas and Democrats in California are plowing ahead with plans to redraw their congressional districts to dramatically help their parties keep or hold the House in 2026. The situations are very fluid. I would say, Jacob, you wrote a story in the newsletter last issue that gives an overview that people should check out if you haven't already. And then we will have more specific breakdowns of the California and Texas, the proposed maps. They won't be necessarily finalized, but those proposed maps in the coming days, so people can check out InsideElections.com in the future, because those are two important states and situations for that fight for the House.
Just the tip of the iceberg on redistricting potentially over the next couple of months. In a state that will not be redistricting, Alaska, former state Senator Tom Begich became the first Democrat to launch his campaign for governor, joining a field that already includes 7 Republicans. Begich is a former state Senate minority leader and a member of Alaska's most prominent political family. So he is the uncle of incumbent Congressman Nick Begich III, the brother of former Senator and 2018 Democratic gubernatorial nominee Mark Begich, and the son of the late Congressman Nick Begich Sr. Now, Begich did say that he would drop out of this race, the gubernatorial race, if former Representative Mary Peltola decides that she wants to run for governor. But Peltola has been pretty quiet about which of the three potential races she could pursue in the next election cycle that she is most interested in.
I saw Mark Begich at the airport as we departed for our family trip just a couple of weeks ago, and to his, he was too far away, and I was a little detained not by TSA, but by my kids or else I probably would have been peppering him with questions about what he thought. But that was never, even when trying to go on a trip, what we do is never too far from my mind. 1/3 of the South Carolina Republicans in the House are running for governor. Ralph Norman and Nancy Mace are both running, setting up a competitive primary for the state's top job and setting up primaries for their open seats. In all three cases, the statewide race and their House races, the primary is probably the most important race because all of those places are pretty darn Republican. That's actually the official term, pretty darn Republican. But we actually published a table with all the details of the House open seats in the most recent issue of the newsletter last week.
Joe Wilson, who is would make up half of the delegation between Norman and Mace, his son, Alan Wilson, the state attorney general, is one of the other candidates in the race. So it's a small state when it comes to the politics there, and everyone knows each other. And I think it's part of why the primary has gotten so nasty so quickly.
Yep. More to come. I want to welcome our guest, Kyle Kondik of the Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia. Kyle is a veteran political analyst who has appeared online and on air almost everywhere. He's a part of the CBS News election night decision desk. He's also a graduate of Johns Hopkins with a graduate degree and went to undergrad at Ohio University, where he was the editor of the student-run newspaper, making you maybe the seventh college editor that we've had. We're very proud. But Kyle, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Now, before we dive in, what congressional district did you grow up in?
So I grew up in Ohio's 7th congressional district, represented currently by Republican Max Miller. I grew up in Independence, Ohio, which is just south of Cleveland. If anybody out there went to the 2016 Republican convention, you may have stayed at a hotel in Independence, because there are a ton of hotels just south of downtown on 77. It was actually, your question prompted me. Well, first of all, I wanted to make sure that Independence was still in Ohio 7, or was in Ohio 7 currently, but also the lines have really changed a lot in Southern Cuyahoga County over the years. I noticed there was like a little arm of what's currently Dave Joyce's district that extended to pick up Independence back when Steve LaTourette held the sort of northeast corner of Ohio. Dennis Kucinich was my representative for a big chunk of when I was a kid. I think Sherrod Brown held Independence at one point. So it's been a lot of change there.
And well, I remember for that convention, our roll call crew stayed in Paynesville, which is up north on the river, on the lake. But did you know all of that political stuff growing up there, or were you political, or was your family political growing up?
I really was not. I mean, I think I probably had some vague sense of Kucinich just because he was he's such a big character. I mean, he was mayor of Cleveland and got voted out. But no, my family was not political. I mean, I had a vague sense of them, voting. In fact, both my parents voted for Perot in '92, which is something that I really remember. I guess I was probably 8 or 9 when that election was happening. Generally speaking, they were kind of New Deal Democrats, and got more so, I think, as I got older. But I never, we weren't really involved in anything. I didn't really get into politics until I was in college, specifically the 2004 presidential election, which I think I'm in my early 40s, I think was probably a formative moment for a lot of people my age.
Yeah, and I guess the district lines from that home congressional, those could change later, right?
Yeah.
I guess the district
Yeah,
could change.
tell us where independence is going to be next year.
Well, I mean, look, if if Republicans want to hurt Amelia Sykes, like going north into picking up sort of parts of southern Cuyahoga County, which are some places. I mean, Independence is pretty Republican, but that may be one way that they try to do it, is sort of cut up that district more to to hurt Amelia Sykes. And so that's one of the, there's all this redistricting talk, which we can get into if you want, but we knew Ohio was going to have new maps going into 2026. That was the one sort of certainty we had. And now we've got all these other states who are opting to do these mid-decade or talking about doing these mid-decade redraws.
Yeah, well, we have a couple of big things to talk about, so let's move on.
I didn't plan to run for office again, but when I see what's going on, I know I can do something about it for Ohio. That's why I'm running for Senate. Because even in these challenging times, I still believe if you stand up for workers, treat people with respect, and always fight for Ohio, you can actually make a difference.
That was former Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown in his recent announcement video. He's challenging Republican Senator Jon Husted, who was appointed to replace Vice President J.D. Vance. Kyle, we know you're from Ohio. You worked in politics in Ohio, literally wrote a book about Ohio politics called The Bellwether. Tell us, how surprised were you that Brown actually got into this race?
Yeah, I wrote that book on Ohio, The Bellwether, that came out in mid-2016, and it was accurate for a few months after that, and then it wasn't accurate anymore because Ohio, after several decades of voting very similarly to the country, obviously has sort of lurched to the right in the Trump era, which is a big part of Sherrod Brown's problem in losing in 2024. He did do significantly better than Kamala Harris did in Ohio, but he didn't outrun her enough to actually win. I was a little bit surprised. Although there'd been some reporting, a week or two before the big report from Cleveland.com and other national outlets came out that Brown was doing it, and he officially got in. It seemed like he was considering governor, although I had heard earlier in the summer that maybe the governor thing wasn't as real as maybe we thought it might be. And there were all these reports of Chuck Schumer going to Ohio at least twice, and maybe more than that, to try to recruit Sherrod Brown into the race. And so it was, if you told me back in May or June, I would have been very surprised. Later in the summer, I guess maybe not as much, but I think it was still mildly surprising, particularly because if Brown would actually win, his reward would be having to run again in 2028 in a presidential year, and he'd face the same challenges he had in 2024. But he is doing the national party a solid here by doing this. So Democrats can be happy about that, I think.
Do you think there's a chance that is really what he's doing, and this is a 2-year favor to his colleagues in the Senate, and come 2028, he might just say, all right, you've got a better map now, you've got opportunities in other states, in Wisconsin and where else, you might be able to pick off a few more states. You don't actually need me for the majority anymore. I'm going to go enjoy my 70s in retirement.
It's possible, although I guess I don't know if I would quite get the logic of that. Although I guess if you look at it and say for Democrats that, hey, we don't like Donald Trump, we don't want Trump to have any more power, we want to win back the House and the Senate. The House, obviously the redistricting thing is going to have some role there, but the Democrats should have a better chance to win the House than the Senate. In order to win the Senate for 2026, you'd have to put a state like Ohio really into play. I mean, I think as we look at the map now, like Ohio is basically a must win with Sherrod Brown in order for Democrats to win the Senate majority. And I still think, and I think you guys still think this too in your ratings, is that I still think Jon Husted is favored in this race, although it's certainly a much more active race than it otherwise would have been.
Yeah, and how did you all land on your rating, and was there much of a discussion? I know we could talk about, there was kind of a rigorous discussion on the Inside Elections side about how to acknowledge a former senator getting into the race, but also acknowledge that he just lost. And so how did you all talk about that conversation on the crystal ball side?
Yeah, so the crystal ball, really the ratings decisions are made by me, my colleague J. Miles Coleman, and then Larry Sabato, who's been the director of the Center for Politics since its inception, and our publication Sabato's Crystal Ball is named for Larry. But the three of us, we'll sometimes talk on the phone, bat things over by email. In this instance, I think it was that Axios report that came out several weeks ago that suggested that Brown was thinking of hiring a campaign manager, and at that point we were like, oh, this seems like a pretty real thing. What do we think about this? And we had it as likely Republican previously, and so we thought leans made some sense. I think that's what I initially proposed, and my colleagues agreed with me on that. And so we sort of just came to that decision. And actually, one thing we did is we had written our crystal ball. Our main article was about, I think it was about redistricting that week, but we had some little news and notes at the bottom of the article, and we sort of telegraphed what we were going to do if Brown actually got in. We said, hey, if this happens, we'll go likely our leans are, and then it actually happened. So we were ready to make the change.
In your estimation, what will Brown need to do to get back on the right side of the ledger? I mean, we've seen him run statewide. We had 4 statewide Senate bids over the last 20 years that he was successful in, or 3 that he was successful in, and 1 that he fell short. Where does he need to make up ground? How does a Democrat win Ohio in 2026? Him, whoever it may be, how does that even happen anymore in a state that hasn't elected a Democrat statewide since Sherrod Brown in 2018?
Yeah, so I'm going to go in the weeds here a little bit, but I think it's something your listeners would appreciate. So in 2022 and 2024, that's when I started doing the election night stuff for CBS, which has been really cool and really, really fun. Anthony Salvanto and Kabir Khanna lead up that team at CBS, and it's been a real privilege to be able to work with them. But one of the things they asked me, because I do know Ohio pretty well, is they said, hey, there's some places you're watching for both the 2022 J.D. Vance, Tim Ryan race, and then also for Brown and Moreno in 2024. And I came up with 4 counties, and I think they kind of help sort of identify key places in the state. So 2 of them are in Northeast Ohio, Erie County, where Sandusky is, and then Portage County, where Kent State University is. And Portage is sort of in between Akron and Youngstown. In fact, that used to be, I think, part of Tim Ryan's old congressional district, which was a Democratic PAC created in advance of 2012 that became very competitive by the end of the decade because Democrats had so eroded with working class white voters in Northeast Ohio and all over the state, really, but particularly Northeast Ohio. And those 2 counties, Erie and Portage, are places where if you were to see a bounce back amongst white working class voters, you might see them in those places because they're sort of a little bit ancestrally Democratic. Then in Northwest Ohio, Wood County, which is south of Toledo, that's where Bowling Green State University is. It's also got some Toledo suburbs. Wood County has been like a pretty decent sort of bellwether for where Ohio is in the last couple of decades. And then the other place is north of Columbus, Delaware County, which is you could argue is sort of traditionally the most like rock rib Republican county in the whole state of Ohio historically, but it's also very affluent, very highly educated. It's kind of place where, of course, Trump Republicans have sort of lost steam over the years, even as in Ohio, Trump has sort of gained in much of the rest of the state. But there you've got sort of lapsed Republican voters. But the reason why I picked those places and why I think they're still germane for 2026 is that it sort of shows what Brown would have to do. He'd have to continue to increase Democratic performance in affluent suburban areas, which is where Delaware qualifies. He'd have to win kind of a key bellwether county, and he'd also have to win back enough white working class voters in Northeast Ohio. And in both 2022 and 2024, the Democratic Senate candidate didn't win any of those counties because the race actually wasn't that close. It was 3.5 points in 2024 and then about 6 in 2022. But those are the places that I would watch. And, for Jon Husted, the Republican appointee and the likely nominee next year, he's someone who probably has a little bit more appeal in that like Delaware County area than a Bernie Moreno and J.D. Vance would, because Husted is like a pre-Trump, pre-MAGA Republican. He's been around in state politics for a very long time. So sort of threading that needle for Brown is really difficult. And that's why I think it's a leans Republican race, although, of course, the political environment will matter a lot.
And talk a little bit more about Husted versus Moreno, because Husted is more of an establishment. I think you said pre-Trump, pre-MAGA Republican, but he also doesn't have that outsider profile that Moreno had, right? I mean, he's Husted, meaning he has now he's the incumbent, which can bring advantages with fundraising, but he's also taken votes now that he can be held responsible. I know Democrats are going to want to bring up First Energy and try to connect him to that situation, I guess, in Ohio. So what do what is the net, I guess? Is Brown on the net? Is he facing a stronger or weaker Republican than the one he lost to last cycle?
I think to start with, he probably is facing a stronger candidate, because I think also, Moreno, and also to some extent Vance, when he was running for Senate back in 2022, they were kind of controversial candidates who said sort of controversial things. Husted probably isn't going to hurt himself in that sort of way. Although I guess the sort of downside is that, unlike the other two who could credibly be thought of as sort of outsiders, and I think particularly on the Republican side, that kind of brand has been pretty appealing recently. Husted cannot be described as an outsider. I mean, he's been in elected politics in a number of different capacities. He was the Speaker of the State House. He was Secretary of State. He's now the Lieutenant Governor. And so it's actually kind of an interesting contrast at what's the likely top of the ticket, in that you've got Husted, who is, I think, in the tradition of the quote unquote establishment Republicans in the state, although, he's certainly been very loyal to Trump in terms of his voting record. And you've got Vivek Ramaswamy as the likely Republican gubernatorial nominee, who's very much kind of a post-Trump, MAGA kind of Republican politician who became famous, running for president and is now running for governor. And, Husted wanted to be governor, but he ended up taking the Senate appointment, I think in part because Ramaswamy was, really emerged as a credible contender for the nomination. I mean, Ramaswamy also forced out Dave Yost, the state attorney general, who's a very well-established, Columbus area politician who's finishing up 2 terms as AG, and it was 2 terms as state auditor. So it's a great. It really shows the kinds of candidates that Republican voters seem to be looking for now, kind of fresh faces, people who are sort of outsiders, as opposed to someone like Yost, who's really been in elected office for a very long time.
Do you think there was anything that Sherrod Brown could have done to win last year, or ultimately was between the combination of the national political environment and the shifts within Ohio, did that essentially make it a lost cause, regardless of the campaign that he ran?
Do you remember there was reporting, I think it was in maybe September or October, I would cite the source, I just can't remember it, but there was some report basically saying that Brown was telling people that if Harris could hold Trump to 7 or 8 point win in Ohio, that he had a decent chance to win. And it turned out Harris ended up losing by 11. But, that actually was pretty on point, because if it had been 7 or 8, maybe Brown would have won by half a point. He did, he ended up losing by 3.5 points, 11 minus 7 is 4 points. So, if Harris had it lost by 7 or 8 points, he might have done it. So that's a long way of saying that I do think ultimately Ohio just voted too strongly for Trump for Brown to win. And, that was something that was really out of the hands of Sherrod Brown. And to some extent, 2026 is out of the candidate's hands too, in terms of, what's the political environment? If it's a big, 2006, 2018 Democratic wave, Brown might very well have a decent chance to win. He's got a better surfboard than I think other Democratic possibilities in Ohio would have, meaning that he could take advantage of the wave in a way that maybe some other Democrats couldn't, because they don't have fundraising chops or they're not well known or whatever. But Brown gives Democrats an opportunity here to win if the environment allows it.
And what do you think, as you look at you look at all the races, even though you have you're expert in Ohio, you're expert on lots of races, that Sherrod Brown, 72 years old, former Governor Roy Cooper in North Carolina is 67 years old, potentially running for the Senate. In Janet Mills in Maine may be challenging Susan Collins. That this Democrats are relying on this aging group of politicians to help win back the Senate at a time when part of the party is crying out for younger voices and fresher faces.
Yeah, I mean, there's been this whole discussion on Democratic circles, kind of hand wringing and beating themselves up over 2024, which is totally understandable. But about this idea of maybe they need to turn to fresher faces. But the kinds of candidates who are emerging in these Senate races are very much the kinds of candidates you could have imagined from pre-2024, Democrats. We'll have to wait and see about Maine. There was this, I don't blank on the guy's name right now, but the oyster play, right. He's was sort of a, is a different kind of candidate. And I guess we'll see if Janet Mills doesn't run, who ends up winning that nomination and how they end up doing. But yeah, I mean, Brown is certainly, someone who's been around for a long time. The Democrats, I feel like, are still kind of leaning into experience and office holding backgrounds. We'll see how that sort of develops over the course of the cycle.
Did Brown, obviously Brown was freezing the field before he announced, and somewhat freezing the gubernatorial field as well. I know Amy Acton was in the race there, but did he squeeze out people in this Senate race? I mean, are there now Ohio Democrats who wanted to run for the Senate who are going to have to wait and potentially miss the last good opportunity or decent opportunity to win statewide in Ohio for a while?
I don't necessarily think so. Although the one, important moving piece here is redistricting, because what if an Amelia Sykes or Greg Landsman in Cincinnati, what if they get a district that's basically unwinnable for them? The Senate race would have been kind of an outlet for them to run, and that door is now closed. I mean, it seems like Tim Ryan was more interested in running for governor anyway, and now he might get the opportunity to do that in a way that maybe he wouldn't have done if Sherrod Brown had decided to run for governor. But I don't think that there was some, I don't think there were a lot of people like looking at the Senate race beyond Sherrod Brown. It's just that, based on the district drawing, it might have made sense for somebody to move over to the Senate race. And again, that door I think is now closed.
And as we move on, I mean, you mentioned the national political environment, in the overall political environment, and that is key because it's not just key in Ohio, but Democrats probably need a good environment to defeat Susan Collins in Maine, because they haven't been able to do that yet. They probably need a good environment to win states like Iowa and Texas, and they'll probably need to win at least one of those in order to get to the 4 that they need. So, and we're not going to know what the mood of the electorate is until we can tell what it is now, but it matters more, whereas a year from now, and we're a long way away.
In terms of the generic ballot polling, it seems a little softer for Democrats now than it was this time in 2017. I also think that the party itself was just kind of more cohesive and more confident back in 2017 than it is in 2025, despite having lost to Trump in 2016. This election was sort of harder to write off as some sort of fluke or something. I will say, though, that, one indicator that we sometimes look at, which actually wasn't a very good indicator in 2024, but has been in some other elections, is these, special elections for Congress and state legislatures. And those results look pretty similar to 2017 in terms of Democrats being more engaged. Of course, the turnout is always going to be lower in those races, even compared to a midterm, let alone a presidential. But I think the key thing for Democrats was just, kind of like I said before, is putting enough good candidates out there that if the environment allows it, maybe they could actually win one or more of these double-digit Trump states in the Senate, which is how I describe Ohio and Iowa. The one candidate decision coming up here, maybe, that I think I'm really curious about is Mary Peltola in Alaska, because there was, that seemed like she might run for governor, and now maybe there's some buzz that maybe she would run for Senate instead. And I don't know. I'd actually be curious to know what you guys would think about this, but that's like a likely or safe Republican. I think we have a safe Republican if as without Peltola in the race, but that probably gets in a more competitive category. I don't think it's a toss up if Peltola runs for Senate, but certainly I think you'd consider putting it in a more competitive category.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I guess Jacob and I haven't had this specific rating discussion offline, but let's have it online. It can't be solid. If Peltola gets in, it can't be a solid race.
Yeah, and I think it's like it's probably leans are likely. Just my own thinking about it, and I'd have to think about that a little bit because Peltola's a pretty strong candidate, and Alaska's kind of a strange state. I mean, it's still pretty Republican at the federal level. But Peltola obviously won the House race in 2022. It has some weird sort of divisions in the state legislature, these sort of coalitions that come up, and it could very well have a competitive governor's race. I mean, I think if Peltola ran for governor, I mean, I think it'd be like you could almost argue she'd be favored, or probably a toss up. But Senate's a little bit different. But again, you think about it in terms of particularly for candidates who have national donor networks, and I mean Brown certainly has that. What's the easier sell? Well, running for Senate's probably the easier sell because there's no national conference of governors that sets national policy. The Senate is really important. It's more important than the House in terms of given the powers that it has for appointments and whatnot. So I could see why national Democrats, while of course they'd love to have a Democratic governor of Alaska or Ohio, they'd much rather have a Democratic senator from those places.
Yeah, and just showing that we're talking about Alaska, Ohio, Iowa, Texas shows the difficulty or the rough path that Democrats take. But let's move on. Where did ratings even come from? While a few folks such as Kevin Phillips and Alan Barron dabbled with ratings going back to the late 70s, the first person to make ratings a regular feature was Charlie Cook back in April of 1984. Stu Rothenberg followed suit in the Rothenberg Political Report a few years later, and the rest is history. Now, it seems like everyone does ratings. I can't speak to how everyone else does it, but I can talk about how we do it at Inside Elections. But before I disclose the secret sauce, it might be helpful to talk about how we don't do it. And it's an excuse to play some movie clips. It's not a magic potion or spell.
Wingardium Leviosa. Stop.
It's not a specific equation.
That's it.
And it's definitely not from Twitter. The reality is that it's usually just me in a darkened room with a six-pack of Mountain Dew listening to melodic death metal from Sweden. Okay, that's not quite right either. That's a fun video we did a few years ago that I'll link to in the chatter, but let's pull back the curtain a little bit on our corner of the political analysis world. Like us, Kyle, you all rate races, and we know that with that responsibility comes a lot of criticism or opinions about those ratings. So how do you filter that criticism, when you publish a fresh set of ratings? What do you do with that information?
I think you have to set aside or sort of put it in two camps. Some of it is, Twitter or X sniping and social media sniping that sometimes is very useful, but also sometimes you get feedback that really is very legitimate because there are lots of different people with different opinions on these races. And sometimes you might be, missing something that maybe you thought you had nailed down and you have to sort of reconsider it. I remember one time just to sort of a rating change I made that I think I basically quickly determined was a mistake was back in 2018. Of course, big Democratic year, but Washington's 5th congressional district, which is the eastern part of the state. Nathan, you're from Washington, aren't you? From Seattle?
I grew up in Oregon, but I'm a Seahawks fan. So
okay.
The line gets blurred. The line gets blurred there in the Pacific Northwest.
Got to apologize for that mistake anyway. Right. But that eastern, it's like Spokane and I think Washington State University is in that district, and so it's like. It's not really a competitive district, but it can sometimes be on the periphery. Tom Foley, when he was Speaker of the House in the 94 wave, that was basically the district that he held that he lost in that election. And at the time, it seemed like it could sort of be on the borderline of being competitive. And Democrats had a pretty credentialed candidate. And as the sort of the top two results were coming in, which sometimes can tell us something about what the future may hold, the top two results kind of suggested that it might be more of a toss-up sort of race. So I actually moved it, and I immediately heard from somebody in Washington State saying, "Hey," a Republican basically like, "Hey, you shouldn't have moved this. The results aren't quite baked yet. It's probably going to get a little redder in those results, and I think we're going to be fine in that district." And sure enough, the results did get a little bit better for Republicans, and it was a competitive race, but I think it was Kathy McMorris Rodgers back then, but she did end up winning, fairly comfortably. So like a couple weeks after I moved to toss up, I moved to Leans Republican, which was, I never should have moved at the toss up. And that was the lesson I needed to learn about some of these late reporting states, that you really got to wait until everything is in. Before you make some sort of judgment on, like, a California where the top two results can sometimes be helpful, sometimes not, and then also a state like Washington State. So, that's just one lesson I've learned over the years, not to jump the gun.
Well, in California, if you wait for all the results, you might be waiting for 6 months for those to come in. So that makes it frustrating.
Yeah, just thinking about this redistricting, this ballot issue that looks like the Democrats are going to put in front of voters. Like, how long is it going to take for us to know that? I mean, maybe it's a blowout and we know on election night, but that could be a very delayed thing that we're thinking about. This, that's important for this calendar year.
That is a good question that I had not thought about before this.
So one of the things that you guys do that sets you apart from the other people in our little cadre is right before an election, you move all of your races out of toss-up to one side or the other, which is a very gutsy maneuver. And I'm curious, I guess, what was the impetus for making that decision, to make that the practice? And then are those conversations any different than the conversations you're having about ratings changes throughout the course of the cycle? Are they more specific, or do they differ in some way, or is it basically just you have to make a change and you're debating it like you would any other ratings change?
Yeah, I think that's always very often been the policy of the crystal ball, and I've been at there for almost 15 years now, and that was what the policy was when I got there. So that's just how we've always, at least as long as I've been there, how we've always done it. And I don't think the conversation is really all that much different. I mean, we feel like, we have to make a decision because we think, well, there's always going to be a winner of some of these races. Like, I think on a few rare occasions, we've done like a toss-up lean runoff rating. which was like, for like a Georgia or a Louisiana. But, we just feel like you're sort of handicapping this throughout the year. You might as well go for it and push all of them. And, you generally get more criticism for the ones you missed than credit for the ones you get, but it is what it is. And I also sometimes wish I had that toss-up tilt rating that you guys use. Because I feel like sometimes races really do sort of feel do end up in that sort of squishy sort of category. So I don't think it's something we're going to implement, but I do sometimes wish we had it in our in the quiver or whatnot. But a lot of, I mean, the weekend before the election, we're all sort of just checking in with people and looking at the last polls, and and of course we've thought about where to go on the toss-ups, for months in advance of the election, and we just try to push them. I've thought about maybe leaving some toss-ups, but then just offering a pick. But we haven't done that. But we feel like if you're going to have a record of wins and losses or whatever, you kind of got to push the toss-ups at the end. But I totally get why people wouldn't do that. And also, I sometimes wish we didn't do that because particularly like 2024 presidential, it's just like there's just a lot of confusing stuff going on. But anyway, it is what it is.
Well, I'll take people even more behind the scenes. That we obviously embrace that tilt category, but as we are redoing our website, that can create some challenges, having 9 categories that you're trying to display across the spectrum rather than 7. It gets a little crowded or a little messier and less clean than the typical 7 category system. So more than some people wanted to know, but there you go.
And Kyle, looking forward to 2026. I know it's still early, though. It's getting later every day. I had a moment the other day where I realized that September was all these things that I knew were happening in September were going to start happening within a matter of weeks. Where are you looking for sleeper races? Where do you think is not getting enough attention from national media, from the parties themselves, as they are beginning to game out either the House or the Senate battlefield ahead of next year?
So I do think that the Senate is kind of a place to look here, and I guess we talked about some, so maybe they aren't really sleepers. I think it's interesting in Texas. Kind of seemed like John Cornyn was sort of almost like dead man walking in the primary, and there's been like a little bit of improvement for him in the polls, and I do think that there probably is a substantive difference between Cornyn or Ken Paxton, the state AG, being the candidate in Texas in the general election. Although I would expect both of them to be pretty strongly favored to actually win that race. But, some things that and this is a trap you sometimes fall into for race ratings, is that sometimes things that you think are solid and you feel confident about, and then you sort of set them aside and then kind of creep back up and surprise you. And I would just point to that Texas Senate primary as one where maybe the conventional wisdom on that could be changing. Although, again, I still think John Cornyn's in a tough spot in that race. And, we're also getting into, I'm going to assume we're going to see some retirements in September. People are coming back from recess. You've got this redistricting decision. I mean, there was just a report the other day that maybe David Schweikert, who represents I think kind of a very competitive Phoenix area district, that he might run for governor. There's going to be decision time for some of these members, and that's the incumbency is not worth what we historically would have thought it's worth. Particularly like when like Stu Rothenberg and Charlie Cook were like doing this back in the 80s. Like, I think they would probably thought, oh, incumbency is really important. It really was back then. But less so now. But you still generally rather have an incumbent running in these races than an open seat. So I'm curious to see if there's like a Trump +8 seat that becomes open or something, and maybe that actually comes onto the playing field in a way that maybe you wouldn't have thought. Actually, maybe a good example of that is you've got this Southwest Michigan district, Michigan 4. Bill Huizenga is the incumbent there. He seemed like he wanted to run for U.S. Senate and was kind of blocked by Trump and Republicans from doing that. Does he seek another term or does he retire? That would be probably a real race if he retired. So the retirement thing is probably going to put some of these sleepers on the board, and in ways that maybe we don't anticipate now.
Yeah, his announcement saying that he was not going to run for the Senate was there was a vacuum there of what he didn't say. He didn't mention his reelection. As we wrap up, Kyle, what has been the most significant change that you've seen in doing political handicapping race ratings over the 15 years that you've been there?
It seems like there's been a real rise in the number of places doing what I describe as sort of quantitative forecasting. I think like Nate Silver and the sort of original 538 is sort of the best example of that. But there are others who have sort of come along and made models. And I like all that stuff. I know some of the folks who do that sort of work. But I do think it is a little bit different than what we do at the Crystal Ball and what you guys do at Inside Elections, or what like the Cook Political Report does, in that it's more qualitative, in that we don't have a model that's sort of, I mean, we look at models and whatnot, but we don't necessarily have a model spitting out what the rating should be or what the percentages should be. We kind of make it's up to us. I mean, if we decide tomorrow that a race that leans Republican is a toss up, we just do it. We don't need, we may have a reason for doing it, but it's not based on some sort of model. But there's been a real rise in that sort of work, and I appreciate it. I'd also think in terms of the political dynamic and environment, it's just so interesting that like the kind of conventional wisdom when I started in 2011 was that, Democrats benefited from higher turnout. Maybe they do better in presidential than midterm elections and that sort of thing. And that has totally turned on its head over 15 years. Now, I don't think that, I think it's also made me sort of more cautious about saying, oh, well, one party or the other has some sort of structural advantage in a certain election format. But again, the conventional wisdom on that just totally changed, because, the voter bases of the parties have changed. And, I think it's like, it can be easy to say, oh, well, voter choice is stable and not much changes, but like you go across the country, like really a lot does change, and a lot has changed over the course of 15 years of doing this.
Yeah. Ohio being one of those things and one of those places.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And now it's time for our final segment, Look What I Found, where we talk about anything that we've been into or watching or reading recently. It's usually not political. Jacob, what did you find?
So I put my life in my hands. I ventured out into Washington, D.C. By myself. I took the bus.
It's an emergency.
I know it was really, I was white knuckling it the whole way down to Capitol Hill to a relatively new restaurant. I guess it opened last year, called Pasquale, which is just north of Stanton Park. For those of you who are in the area, it's a Mexican restaurant. It was wonderful. They do a very nice job there. It was like a fancy meal, small plates, but they have all sorts of crazy seafood. I got a whole lamb neck barbacoa, which was very tasty. And it was just like a really nice time. I think if you're in the market for like a kind of expensive dinner out in Washington, D.C., and you're okay, going Mad Max mode and traversing the roads out here, then as long as you steer clear of the assault vehicles that are roaming the streets, it's a nice time.
I was interested, and then when you said lamb neck, I don't know. I don't know if I could do it. But for those of you,
it's just another part of the animal.
Yeah, but there's a lot of parts of the animal you could say that about that I wouldn't eat. But I don't live too far from there. And for those of you that are familiar with the neighborhood, I think that's the old Kenny's Barbecue space. So to go further back. But Kyle, what did you find?
So there's this sort of online meme or joke about basically middle-aged white men, which I guess I qualify now. I'm going to be 42 this year, but they either start getting into World War II or they start getting into Roman history. And I did World War II when I was in high school. That was actually, in some ways, it was kind of an entry point for me to get interested in politics, because interested in World War II, well, you come along FDR and Churchill, and those become, those are huge figures, and so that kind of got me interested in politics to some degree when I was in high school. But now I'm doing Rome. I've been doing Rome for the past several years, and so I fit right in that stereotype. But I read it's kind of a trilogy. But Tom Holland, the English historian, he did this sort of book called Rubicon, which came out like 20 years ago, about the end of the Roman Republic and Caesar and start of the empire and all that. And then a book called Dynasty, which is sort of the Caesar Augustus and on through the quote unquote year of 4 emperors. And I think there was like a year of 5 emperors at one point, but anyway. And then there was the most recent one called Pax. And so I read all those over the last, I don't know, probably 6 months or something. And they're fabulous. I totally recommend them.
Well, when I was I was actually at Cedar Point earlier this summer in Ohio, and there was a guy walking around with a shirt that said "Roman Empire, never forget," like hashtag never forget. So I don't know, maybe we should find that. How often do you think about the Roman Empire, Kyle?
I mean, these days I think about the Roman Empire a lot, not even necessarily trying to make comparisons to modern times, although there probably are comparisons you can make. But I just I don't know, I just got interested in it for whatever reason. I like so many others, I listened to the Mike Duncan History of Rome podcast, which was really good. I made an exception. Usually I just listen to NBA podcasts, but I made an exception to listen to a history podcast, and I thought it was great.
So I found that I never want to be in the shipping business. So this summer when I was in Oregon at my parents' house, they still have a number of my old toys. And so I had some old action figures, some mid-'80s Kenner DC Superpowers, this big Hall of Justice. And then I had a Voltron. Some of you know these toys. And I found that some of them had decent resale value. So I went through the process of trying to sell these on eBay, and it is a lot of work. I was like, oh my goodness. I mean, just navigating, I'd bought stuff on eBay before. I've never sold anything. And so it was crazy. My mom was incredibly helpful, but it felt like we were running the kitchen table at my parents' house, just full of cardboard boxes and stuff. But we did it. We sold some stuff. My kids, one of my sons in particular, we learned a lot about supply and demand and how to set pricing and when to bring prices down. But I never want to do that. It's not a quick buck, what I found.
Well, and you really brought it back full circle for us, Nathan, because in the new Superman movie, which I believe was one of my Look What I Founds a couple weeks ago, the Hall of Justice is portrayed by the Cincinnati Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio. So everything leads back to Ohio. It's all Ohio. It always has been. And there you go.
That's good. Well done. Yeah, and I found that the Superman, the one Superman action figure sold for almost as much as the entire Hall of Justice, which I was not. I was surprised by that going into it. But anyway, more people have now more information. Kyle, thank you for joining us. Everyone needs to follow Kyle both on Twitter /X and read the Crystal Ball. But thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And also Inside Elections is a great publication. I read it a lot.
At Inside Elections, we provide nonpartisan analysis of congressional, presidential, and gubernatorial races. With a combination of reporting and data, we break down the key races and bring valuable context to complex elections. Please go to InsideElections.com to subscribe to our bi-weekly newsletter. We have individual subscriptions as well as group packages that are tailored to help corporate and association PACs. If you like today's episode, please subscribe to the podcast, rate us on your favorite platform. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe there, click the thumbs up button, even leave a comment. If you didn't like today's episode, please email Dennis Kucinich. We also want to thank our producers, Alan Tazinski and Melissa Lenner of Pretty Easy Podcasts, and our associate producer, Conrad Tolosa. Please come back and join us again next time.